We just want to welcome you all and welcome our wonderful guest, Jose Molina, who's going to be with us for the next hour. And I'm Robin Bradford, and my partner, John Strong, is here. And we're very excited about our upcoming retreat in October in Scotland. And if you haven't applied yet, we'd love to have you do that. Or if you can't make it this year, please enjoy these webinars we're hosting, because there's a lot of really fantastic information. After the talk, we will chat with anyone who'd like to hang around a bit about specifics about the retreat. But I think let's just get started with Jose. He's got a lot of great stuff to tell us, and John is going to introduce him. And as usual, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we will feed them to Jose.
Yeah.
Feed them. I love that
Yeah.
term. Okay.
We're very excited to have Jose with us. Jose has been working in television for over 25 years, Yale educated. He was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and then relocated to LA after winning the Television Academy screenwriting competition, internship, excuse me. And we'll be talking to him about that as well. During his career, he's collaborated with amazing director and producers like James Cameron, Joss Whedon, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Jordan Peele. Who have you not worked with, Jose? He was also nominated for several humanitarian awards during his tenure on Law and Order SVU, most notably for his episode Alien, which tackled the topic of gay marriage and adoption. He loves sci-fi, horror, and comics, and you might be able to see some cool figurines behind him, which I've already told him that I love. He's currently at work on various development projects, and he hopes to infuse all of those with his love of imaginative drama and his desire to see better Latinx representation in genre entertainment. So welcome, Jose.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We have just a question to start, and that is what movies or television shows or comic books or any kind of material like that inspired you to become a writer when you were young?
So
Or
I've
younger.
always young. You can say young. I'm old now. As you can see behind me, I'm definitely a big genre fan, whether it's sci-fi, horror, fantasy, take your pick. Yeah, exactly. And I was born in the 70s, so I'm a child of the 70s and the 80s, and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. So, some of my earliest, most seminal memories are of the original Star Wars trilogy.
Mhm.
Those movies completely blew my mind. I remember being six in the theater when the first Star Wars came out, and I didn't really speak English very much. And I vividly remember a scene with 3PO and R2 are walking through the desert. And it's in Puerto Rico, so the movie's subtitled, but I couldn't read fast enough. And there were no lips to read, so I couldn't read 3PO or R2's lips. So I just remember being in the theater and poking my mom, going, "What are they saying? What are they saying?" Because I was riveted by this crazy world. And then, Raiders came out in 81, and that was another huge, huge influence on me. But I would say the movie that really made me go, not just like, holy shit, this is amazing, but
Mhm.
like, I need to be a part of this, was Terminator in 84. Because it not only had like the great sci-fi concept, and the great action sequences and all the excitement and the fun, it was also a love story. That movie at its core is a love story between Kyle and Sarah, and that's the part that really, we're gonna be probably talking about writing and how to write successful scripts. And you're gonna hear me say over and over again, it's about the characters. And so this is a movie that really invested in those characters and made you invest in that relationship, that tragic relationship. And I just remember walking out of that theater and sitting outside the movies, waiting for my mom to come pick me up, and just being transported and just being so moved by that movie and everything that it had to say.
Hmm.
So that was really a big one. But probably the most seminal thing for me growing up was I remember going to visit family in St. Louis when I was 10. And my grandmother took me to a Toys R Us, which we didn't have in Puerto Rico. And she basically said, look around, pick a toy, and I'll buy that for you, and that'll be your birthday present. And I'm looking around like a kid in a candy store. Um, and what I found that made me go, this is amazing, was the Dungeons and Dragons Red Box, which, if you guys don't know, is the introduction, the starter set basically for
Uh-huh.
Dungeons and Dragons, which has the instruction manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and an adventure that you can play. So I got that. By the way, how's that for an indication that I'm nerdy? I'm in a toy store and I bought a book. Uh,
That's
so I took
awesome.
that back home, and roped all my friends into playing D&D with me, and it was great. I was the dungeon master. I was running the game. Um, but once we played the module that the adventure that was in that red box, we had nothing else to play. Because there were no hobby shops, no real comic book shops in Puerto Rico, so there was nowhere I could go to buy them. So
Hmm.
that's when I started writing them myself.
Oh,
And so
wow.
that's the first writing I ever did, was writing D&D adventures for my
Um,
junior high buddies.
So
And I
great.
would rip off, Raiders. There was definitely an adventure with a giant boulder chasing my friends, and ripping off Star Wars and ripping off, all those great sci-fi fantasy. Clash of the Titans is another great one. And I started reading mythology. But that purchase 100% changed my life. I don't know that I would be a writer were it not for D&D, and I'm still playing, 40 some years later.
Wow. What's a
wow.
great point you make about character, because for me anyway, the best stories are those that really are developed character wise, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's a murder, whether it's a rom-com. I mean, plenty of writers don't work on character and they depend on plot to carry them along. But I just find I don't have interest in those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jose, I love hearing about all that because I'm also a child of the 70s and 80s. 1985 was my year that got me interested because that was Back to the Future, The Goonies, and Young Sherlock Holmes.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what really got me interested. But so from your D&D and all those amazing movies we saw in the 80s, and then you had a big step that got you into and writing professionally. Was that the Television Academy internship that you received? Can you tell us if that's true? Can you tell us about that, more about that?
Yeah, no, that was so I knew that I wanted to be a writer. Like, I was writing short stories and really, really bad poetry when I was in high school. So I knew that writing was something that I wanted to pursue, but I didn't really know how. And so when I got to college, I declared an English major, and so I continued to write short stories. And in my head, I was gonna probably teach and write on the side and try to be my stated goal to anybody who would listen was I wanted to be the Puerto Rican Stephen King. That was my goal.
Nice. Hmm.
So I was writing all these horror short stories, and but I had no idea how a career was made in this field. And then junior year, I needed one more class to fill out my schedule, and I stumbled across a screenwriting class.
Mm.
And I went and I took it, and it was like it met once a week at like 4 p.m. And it was everybody talked about it like this is the easiest class you'll ever take. And I went in there and I realized that it was probably going to be the easiest class I ever took because I knew everything. I knew all the movies, I knew all the references, I knew I could literally quote from all the movies that the teacher was talking about. And I found that I had a little bit of a talent for it. And so, like, when I handed in my pages, the teacher was super, super complimentary, and so were some of the other students. But I still had no idea how I was going to make a living out of this, how to make a career out of it. Until cut to later senior year, I am wandering through the post office, and back then, I don't know if this still happens. They had the flyers that you could rip the tabs at the bottom out of, and there was a flyer for the TV Academy summer internship. Come and work and be a part of the TV industry. And I was like,
Mm.
"What? TV industry? That's a thing?" Uh, and so I ripped off the tab, and I called because there was no internet back then. So I called the phone number and they sent me a packet with information, and I applied and I made it from I think the first cut is like from 8,000 to like 20 to for every category. And then the finalists in the category for the screenwriting category, which is the one that I wanted, you had to write a whole script. Now, I'd taken this class, but I'd never written a whole script and I'd never written a TV script. So I went to the Yale bookstore and I found a book called How to Write for Television by Madeline DiMaggio. And that book saved my life
Huh.
because I had no idea that you structured things in acts, that there's rules to TV, and I knew none of them. So this book was a crash course in that, and then I had a week to write my first script, and I didn't know if was this a lot, was this a little. Turns out it's not a lot, especially for your first ever script. But I sat down and I cranked out an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which had been sort of tumbling around in the back of my head, and I put it on paper, and it turned out great. And they sent it to Michael Piller, who was the showrunner of Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine, and he selected me as the summer intern and put me on Deep
Wow.
Space Nine. So talk about kid in the candy store
Wow.
again. Like
Seriously.
I got that job as a giant Trek nerd, and they put me on the first full season of Deep Space Nine for 8 weeks, where I was, a 21-year-old kid sitting with the writers of one of my favorite shows. So it was
Fantastic.
incredible.
So cool.
Are there other opportunities like that one that exist for writers today?
Well,
Do you
that still
know?
exists. The
Oh,
summer
does it?
internship is still going on. They do it every summer. You have to be either a junior or senior in college to apply for it because it's for students. But yeah, every spring they select it. They select their class, and I believe they're up to 30 internships right now in 30 different categories.
Wow.
Screenwriting is still the most competitive one.
Hmm.
Um, and for years Star Trek hosted those interns. Now Star Trek obviously has changed regime. It used to be, the Rick Berman, Michael Piller regime, and now it's under Alex Kurtzman, and
Oh,
so they don't host interns anymore. But the internship is still alive and kicking and doing really, really well. So go to emmys.com for more information on that.
oh, that's great. I'll put
Yeah.
that in the chat function.
That is great. So, Jose, can you, just in case there's some people here that don't understand what the writer's room is, can you tell them about what that looks like and what the process is for being in a writer's room?
Sure. The writer's room is basically it's a conference room. Everybody sits around. Usually, you sit around a conference room table, and there's anywhere from 6 to 12 people in a drama room. Comedy rooms are bigger. Comedy rooms can have up to 20 people sometimes.
Oh.
Um, But you sit around this conference room table and you have either dry erase or cork boards all around the room. You can see here I have my dry erase boards behind me and I have my cork board over there. So imagine a room that's wall to wall that.
Hmm.
Um, and by the way, my cork board is empty, but I do have cards here that are waiting to go up, so I'm not slacking.
Nice. Okay.
I'm working, I'm writing. And so, you show up to the room, and usually the showrunner or somebody will have brought an idea in. Uh, uh, Ideally, somebody, the showrunner has something that has a beginning, middle, and end, that you can start working on, and then you communally start pitching on, well, what if this was the first scene? What if this scene was the scene that followed that? And you collaborate in telling the story that you sort of came in with, and figure out the best way of telling it. Sometimes you come in with nothing. Sometimes you come in and you're spitballing from, like, where we left our characters. This guy had gotten shown up at a date, and his heart was broken because this girl he really liked that he met online was shining him on, and he didn't know what to do. So that's where we left our character. We can pick him up, and he's decided to join a monastery, says a pitch. To double down and join every website, dating website in town, says another.
Uh-huh.
To call his high school girlfriend and try to reconnect with her, says a third. And so you start banding around ideas, and the showrunner goes, that one, let's do that, let's do that, let's do that. And you can sometimes cobble a story together out of nothing, out of, where we were, and where do we think we want to go.
Trying to introduce me, but
But
not the same. It's not the same.
in a perfect world,
No, you're right.
you do come in with some marching orders, especially these days when you have shows that are more and more serialized. Usually, the showrunners, who are usually the show creators, have a map of the season. And so when you have mapped out all 8 to 10 episodes, that's usually the order these days, you have a rough notion of what every episode is going to be.
Mhm.
So when you get to episode 4, this is the episode where they go down into the tunnels underneath the neighborhood, because that's where One-Eyed Willie's treasure is going to be found. Um, and so you start figuring out, well, okay, what are the obstacles? What are the important, again, character? What are the character arcs? Where do they start? Where do we want them to go?
Mhm.
What emotional obstacles do we want to put in their way? What is their emotional need? And there are people in the room that have different skill sets. Some people are better at plot. Some people are better at, like, the big cool idea, the big out of left field sort of uh, game changer. And some people are better at character. Some people are better at, like, let's put a pin in the bells and whistles and the crazy stunts and the out of left field ideas, and let's make sure that we're telling a story that's a satisfying character journey for our heroes, especially in TV. Your characters, your protagonists are everything.
Yeah.
So that's basically what a room looks like.
And once you
Great.
have that outline, are episodes assigned to people to write
Yeah.
themselves?
Yeah, a lot of the times you start the break, and you know who's going to be writing it. I've been on shows where that's not the case. I definitely prefer the shows where who's going to be taking the ball into the end zone from the beginning, because that way the writer of the episode, if you end the day and you haven't made progress, or there's some questions or there's some blockages, that writer can go home and think about it,
Mhm.
and then come in the next day with pitches for fixes, or a big idea out of left field, or a big uh, um, character revelation. In theory, every writer in the room should be doing that. If there's a block in the story, every writer should go home and think about it and come back to the office the next day with some ideas. That doesn't tend to happen all the time. So if there's a writer who's assigned the script there and the episode, they're the ones that are probably going to lead, if not necessarily lead the break, they're hopefully going to be the ones that are coming in with the most ideas because they're simmering in it, they're stewing in it, even
Mhm.
when the room isn't assembled.
What's really interesting is like a solitary sport taken to a team sport level.
Right.
You know, writers of novels or screenplays and so forth are usually solitary, you know, working in solitude. Do you have a preference? I mean, it sounds like such a great skill set to have to be able to integrate all those ideas and, you know, move forward as a unit, like a team.
Yeah, on Law and Order SVU, we didn't have a room because
Mm,
that show is not at all serialized. It's completely standalone week to week.
uh-huh.
So the episodes didn't need to speak to each other. So we didn't have a room and everybody worked private study.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you would still filter everything through the showrunner or sometimes the number two, the head writer on the staff. And so you'd have an idea for an episode, you'd pitch it up the ladder, and then you'd get feedback, and then you'd go back to your office and you'd work the board on your own. And then when you had the board, you come back, you get feedback, you go away, you write the outline, you get feedback, you write the script, you do the whole process.
Mhm.
But instead of doing it with the whole staff, you do it with either the number two, who's the head writer, or the showrunner. In terms of personal preference, I definitely like the room environment just because I find you get more ideas that way, you get more points of view that way. And you know, writing is solitary enough. When you're writing the script, you're going to be writing it on your own.
Mhm.
So I like having the ability to lean on people. And if I'm writing the script and I get stuck on something, I can knock on somebody's door and go like, "Hey, you remember when we were discussing this point? I'm finding that it doesn't work for this and that reason. Can you help me get through it?" And the person is up to speed.
Great.
Um,
But one of the tricky things about the room is that everybody says the room is democratic, right? Best idea wins. But, you know, you've got 6 to 10 opinionated people who think they have the way they would tell the story. Sometimes those points of view don't agree.
Yeah.
So you need somebody at the top who's going to make that decision and who's going to go, we're doing it like this.
Hmm.
And who can do that diplomatically
Sure.
without making the writers feel like their idea wasn't good or their it's difficult, you know, handling the egos, the fragile egos of 6 to 10 writers in a room when you're the one who's having to make that call. And you know, writing is so subjective. It isn't like you can do math and say, well, that's the idea that has the correct answer. You're
Sure.
ultimately a writer making your own subjective decisions. So that showrunner or that head writer who's running the room and who's got voices coming at him or her the entire time. Um, has to really think fast and think on the fly and go like, I think that's the way we should go. And again, without bruising egos, without hurting feelings. And you know, one of the things that's hardest about that job in that room setting is because you're being bombarded by ideas from all the other writers, it's coming
Mhm.
up with your own ideas while that's happening. Because you're fielding and you're going, yes, no, you're absorbing and it's sometimes hard to go like, oh, here's my idea for how we could approach this problem because your brain is in reception mode, not in output mode.
Uh-huh. Huh.
um, and regarding the titles that you're mentioning, I know that you are also co-executive producer, executive producer on several of the TV shows that you've written on. What does that actually mean, and how does that change your responsibilities?
So the hierarchy of a staff and not every staff has all these jobs, but these are the jobs as they exist from low to high. Entry level is staff writer, then story editor, then executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-executive producer, executive producer. Executive producer is at the top of the food chain. And the responsibilities increase as you go up that ladder, right? If you're a staff writer, nobody's expecting you to know how to budget a script while you're putting it on the board.
Mhm.
Nobody's expecting that you're gonna have years of experience um, in knowing that what you're pitching may not work for a variety of reasons. For instance, in the story that I just made up about the guy who gets stilted on a date, the person that pitches the guy joins a monastery and swears off of dating forever. Well, the show's over. The series
Right.
fails to exist, so that pitch out of left field, interesting, didn't see that coming, doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because you're basically creating a new show. And so a staff writer might pitch that idea, not quite realizing that you have a franchise that you need to paint within the lines, and you can't reinvent the wheel and rebuild sets and recast characters. You need to stay within a certain set
Sure.
of confines. As you go up the food chain, a lot of the middle jobs are similar. They're just reflective of experience. If the co-EP, who's usually the number two, has to step out of the room, he'll usually hand the reins of the room to the supervising producer. If there isn't a supervising producer, he'll hand the reins to a producer. When I was an ESC on Firefly, we had a very small staff. So there were a few times where I was handed the reins of the room, and I was only executive story editor. So I was sort of learning on the fly.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but it's a hierarchy that is there to sort of explain to everybody on day one where everybody lives on the pecking order. Um, How much or how little that is used depends on the showrunner. My last showrunners were very good about if they left the room was mine. And if I left the room, then I handed it to the next person in line. They were very much, they wanted somebody in the room that was empowered to make decisions.
Hmm.
Instead of it, because what can happen if the showrunner steps out, and the showrunner is going to be stepping out the closer you get to production, no matter what. They're going to have meetings, they're going to have to be hiring people, they're going to not be able to devote 8, 9, 10 hours a day to the writer's room. And what can happen is if the showrunner steps out, the room can become a free-for-all, because you've got all these opinionated people who have ideas, and a lot of the times you have people who are, you've all worked with in whatever walk of life, people who are pushier than others and people who are quieter than others. The
Hmm.
quiet people might have great ideas, but they may not be their best advocates. And the
Sure.
pushy people may not have the great ideas, but because they're pushy, their ideas get through. That's the same dynamic in a writer's room. So
Yeah.
that's something that I'm a big fan of avoiding, and by empowering the people who have the most experience and saying, like Captain Kirk leaves the bridge, Mr. Spock is in charge.
Hmm. Yeah. So we have a couple questions from Ronald about, first he's asking, um, is the showrunner a writing or producing position? Can a producer be a showrunner? And is it possible for somebody to be a showrunner on a series but never actually write a script?
99% of the time, the showrunner is a writer.
Okay.
That's
And
something
it's
that
their original idea usually, correct?
usually, yeah, sometimes in development it happens that a creator of a show, for whatever reason, steps aside and leave somebody in charge of their vision. But
Mhm.
again, 99% of the time, that vision is left in the charge of a writer. Now, because of some of the politics that have been going on with the Writers Guild, and feature directors coming into TV, there has been a bit of a push for directors to be showrunners or co-showrunners. That's
Mhm.
something writers and the Writers Guild are fighting really hard to stop, because no one knows story better than a writer. And so we should be the ones who have the vision, who have the experience to know you send this guy to a monastery, you're killing the show.
Right.
A director may fall in love with the idea of, ooh, all those cool monastic robes and all those ancient 13th century sets. Those would be beautiful to shoot in. It's like, yeah, but you have to build them and you're going to cost money and you're telling a different story than what we set out to do. That's
Yeah.
not.
Mhm.
So, producers and non-writing producers can be executive producers, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are the showrunner. The showrunner tends to be one person who is at the top of the food chain, and the buck stops with them. The
Mhm.
final decision is theirs. Now, obviously, they have their own bosses. They have to answer to the studio and the network, and that's a whole different dynamic that we can get into if you guys want. Um, but in terms of the writing staff, there has to be one voice that unifies all the voices, and that tends to be the showrunner, who tends to be the creator of the show. Now, you have a show like Lincoln Lawyer, I was watching recently, which was created by David Kelly, but David Kelly, being an 800-pound gorilla who doesn't have time, who is being pulled in 80 different directions. He created the show and didn't run it. So he
Okay.
handed it over to Ted Humphries, gets a develop by credit on the show. And Ted is the showrunner and the head writer. So Kelly sort of wrote a script, wrote a pilot script, handed it over to Ted and said, "Go with God,
Yeah.
develop the season. I'm out."
Wow.
But that's pretty rare.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay.
Sarah was wondering, once a writer is assigned an episode, do they work with that all the way through post?
It depends, and this is another thing that the Writers Guild is trying to get a little bit more control over. It used to be that a writer would stay with a script through every stage, until it was locked and delivered and done and ready to be aired. Because of streamers and the way production works. So it used to be you're in the room, you're assigned a script, you write the script, you do the notes, you go into prep. You prep the episode yourself. So you're attending meetings, you're the voice of the showrunner in those meetings, you're making decisions about casting, costumes, set design, everything. You're prepping the show to be shot. Then you're shooting, you're in production, you're on set with the director, with the actors, you're producing the episode. Then you wrap your 8 day shoot, you go into post, and you're with the editor, making all the changes and including your showrunner's changes, your changes, uh, thoughts that other people on the staff might have. Then you do studio cut, then you do network cut, then you lock, you sound mix, you do VFX, you do everything, you deliver. That's the ideal way. That's the way that TV worked for 60 years.
Mhm.
Because of the way streamers operate, that it has changed and is continuing to change, and we're trying to win it back a little bit. But what happens is the streamers like to have all the scripts ahead of time. So you're
Mm.
in the room and you're in the room for say 20 weeks. In those 20 weeks, you're going to write those 10 scripts. And then at that point, usually what happens in 2025 is the streamer releases the staff, and that staff is done. And then that's writing those scripts and doing notes on those scripts is the last that writer will see of the episode, leaving the showrunner and sometimes the number two there to oversee the prep, the production, the post of everything, which, as you can imagine, is an ungodly amount of work for one or two people to do by themselves when they used to have a staff of 6 to 10 who could take
Mhm.
some of the burden off of their shoulders.
So,
So,
oh,
yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry. Well, I was just going to ask if there are there are responses, positive responses to a certain actor or plot line that come mid-season. What happens? It just goes as planned, or is there some way of addressing that? Or maybe
Well, what
next season that happens, or what?
what happens if you start seeing dailies and you start seeing cuts and something works or doesn't work
Mhm.
is those same people that are overseeing prep, production, and post at the same time now have to go back into the scripts and
Okay.
have to start rewriting the scripts again with very few hands on deck, usually only one.
Yeah.
And that means sometimes reconceiving entire storylines, sometimes writing actors out of storylines, sometimes getting rid of actors altogether. Um, and again, it's an ungodly amount of work. And one of the wins that we got during the strike a couple of years ago was that the streamers now have to keep uh, a certain number of entities. I can't remember how many, if it's one or two or three. But we one of the things that we wanted to win, because it's also a training ground, was the ability for writers to stay on beyond the writers' room weeks. Because if you have a staff writer who only ever does 20 weeks, writes the scripts, goes away, does the same thing on another show, on another show, on another show, that person is eventually going to get to Cody PEP level and get their own show and create their own show and run their own show, having never dealt with prep, production, post, because they never had that training that my generation had as a given.
Hmm.
So one of the things that the Writers Guild wanted to ensure is that we as writers are able to learn on the job to become producers, to become showrunners, to become creators.
Hmm.
And so we got some gains on that. Not all the gains that we would necessarily want, but there is now a bylaw that states that you have to keep certain number of the staff through production.
I remember reading when the strike was going on, and I was very shocked to learn the difference between, say, back in the 80s and 90s when you had a typical staff writing room and how long they were in the room and how much their salary was, and that they were basically, they'd wait a little bit to start back on the next season. And then what you just explained to us about the streamers and how it's very short, they're in there for a very short time and then they leave. So, what other changes have happened with streaming, and how much is going back to the way that y'all want it to go?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is the training ground that you're doing a job that's a very limited job that's not allowing you to grow. You're doing the same thing year in and year out. And sure, you're learning the ropes on how to write and how to collaborate and uh how to parse through ideas. But you're not learning what it takes to be a showrunner. And b besides any creative considerations, you're also getting paid half or less than half the money that you used to get paid. Because you used to do a job like SVU would take 45 to 48 weeks a year to do, and you stayed on all that time and you got paid through all that time.
Hmm.
Now you get paid 20 weeks, you're gone, you're looking for your next job, and the show is still in production or in post. And it's, you've all seen how long it takes for new seasons of shows to come back around.
Sure.
You can have season one of a show debuting today, and the next season won't premiere till 27 or 28.
Uh-huh.
So the show is working all that time. You're just not there, so you're not getting paid.
Mhm. So when credits are listed for producers, they don't say showrunner on
Correct.
on screen. So would that showrunner be listed as producer rather than executive producer, or how would
No,
they?
executive producer is the top of the food chain in TV.
Okay,
In
okay.
features, the producer is the big boss. In TV, the
Mhm,
executive producer is the big boss. But a show might have, I remember on Terra Nova, we had 12 executive producers. Um, because we had Steven Spielberg and his executives, and we had Aaron Kaplan and his executives, and we had the guy who had created the show who left because he got another show on the air. He was an executive producer. So we had a lot of people that weren't even involved in the day-to-day of the show, who, by dint of their deal, were listed as EPs. Now, Rene Echevarria was the showrunner, but his credit read executive producer just like everybody else, just like all
mhm,
those other 12 people.
mhm. That's great.
Okay.
Oh,
Um,
informative. Thank you. Thank you. That
yeah,
can be
Of
a
course.
confusing, especially when there's such a difference between film and television
Yeah, for
in
sure.
terms of credits. Yeah. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
oh, it's okay. Jose, I love that you won some humanitarian awards. So talking about scripts with some strong social messages, is there is there a certain genre that's easier to write in terms of relaying a social message? Is sci-fi and horror easier than drama, or vice versa?
Well, it's interesting because it sort of depends on what the creator of the show is trying to do on a macro level. Um, you get a show like Andor, for instance, which just ended its brilliant second season. That's a show that Tony Gilroy clearly designed from scratch to be a political show and to
Mhm,
have a very strong political point of view and to relay a very strong, very opinionated message. A lot of the times, the genre shows that I've worked on are mostly just there for entertainment. And my favorite genre movies especially are movies that have something to say and an oblique way of saying it. They're a movie like Terminator is ultimately about um, humanity versus computers and the importance of human connection versus the detachment, the cold clinical detachment of a computer. And when you get into Terminator 2, you get the point of view of motherhood and how women have a certain point of view and a certain perspective that men just don't have by dint of not bearing children. And so this is not what the movie's about, but this is the story that the movie is telling you. Um, so I love that kind of genre, and on the occasion that I've been able to do that kind of genre writing, that's been my favorite. I think Agent Carter might have been my favorite for that purpose,
mhm,
because it was a deeply feminist show. It was a show about a woman
Yes,
in the 40s who was
right.
sidelined after the Second World War and basically asked, even though she fought in the war, she was asked to essentially be a secretary again. And she basically went, "Fuck you, I'm as capable as all of you guys are, and I'm gonna show you."
mhm,
So it was a very empowering show, and I've heard from a lot of women and girls who found it really, really empowering. So I love
That's
that.
awesome.
However, you get a show like SVU, which is again kind of by design then meant to be a hot button show. It's ripped from the
mhm,
headlines half the time. You're dealing with issues that are, making headlines. So you're going to be um, tackling issues, sometimes more, sometimes less. But I did the episode on gay marriage and adoption. I also did one that was about free speech, that was about a shock jock played by Lewis Black, who
Oh, perfect.
basically made a joke about how some actress needed to get laid, and somebody went out and raped that actress. So now, does he have the right to say that? Does he not have the right to say that?
Uh-huh. Huh.
And so those were some of my, I love Law and Order because it allows you the ability to deal with Law and Order. Mothership has done so many amazing uh, trials about putting issues on the forefront and spending half an hour. Uh,
Yeah. And also not being judgmental about, I mean, it's like they're presenting the facts and
right,
the audience is trusted enough to connect the dots and come up with their conclusions.
right,
So
right.
that, I think that's part of the secret of that show's longevity. So we're not being, we're
100%,
not
because
being
there's
lectured.
headlines every week, no matter what year you're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I
I'm
love that
curious
point,
about,
Jose.
so,
Everything you just said was great. Yeah,
yeah, I'm
that was
curious
very
about
integral.
your, like, what's your opinion, or even hate to ask this because of course we don't know yet quite, but AI, what are you seeing with it
Uh,
as it develops?
I know some very smart people who are very much better versed in AI than I am, and
Hmm.
they're terrified of it.
Hmm.
And I am terrified of it. And if you look around, you will find that the grandfathers of AI are terrified of it.
Yeah.
Because it can do, look up I think it's called the paperclip dilemma. Um, and you'll find that the dangers have nothing to do with intention. Now, there can be intention. There can be that that are trying to use AI to hack networks, that are trying to hack weapon networks or power grids,
Yeah.
or you know do all kinds of nefarious things. But there's ways in which AI can run amok and create potentially cataclysmic issues without anybody having any intention of that
Yeah.
as their starting point. So
Definitely.
I am very afraid of AI, and I don't use AI for anything.
Yeah. Well, once you put your information or a picture or whatever into AI, it's available to anyone.
Right. And the
Yeah.
Supreme Court
So
just
she,
passed a ruling this week saying that copyrighted books could be used to train AI.
Oh wow,
And I believe the ACLU immediately filed suit. So
wow.
we'll see what happens there.
wow. Okay.
Wow. We have a question from Jesselyn, who is interested in your process in terms of using the cork board versus um, the cards versus the what was her other one here?
Dry erase.
Yes, thank you.
So the dry erase and the corkboard serve similar purposes for me. Uh, I know a lot of people who look, every writer is different. So what I'm going to tell you is my process
Hmm.
doesn't mean that it should be your process.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who use who do everything on the computer. I know
Hmm.
some older people than me that do everything by longhand on a legal pad. David
Hmm.
Kelly uses
Hmm.
a legal pad and nothing else. Um, when I originate an idea, I tend to start a document on my computer, and I just start to jot down general things like, this is a cool moment, this is a cool character, this is a cool twist, and I'm just sort of free form throwing things into this file. Um, and after a while, and I'm putting together that file while I'm watching movies that might inspire me on a similar topic, um, movies that I think could be, or TV shows, or reading books, or comic books, playing video games that uh, might touch on something similar that might give me an idea. And
Mhm.
so as I'm filtering all this material and I'm putting into my head, I'm jotting down ideas on this document. And after a while, that document will start getting full enough that I can start putting on the dry erase, which is my more temporary version of things. I can start putting up like if you see there on the right, you might not be able to read that, but there's a list of characters. And what I have up there is the list of characters and their arcs. And what they want. The emotional want of a character is foremost for every kind of writing that I do. Um, and by the way, there's an essay by my friend Javier Grillo Marx Watch called Finding the Next Lost, the operational theme and why your show might not have it. Google Javier Grillo Marx Watch operational theme or Finding the Next Lost, and it'll come right up.
Mhm.
And it's all about how character motivates plot. Anyway, back to my process. Once I have stuff on the dry erase, then I start doing this. Then I start writing cards uh, that I know are scenes. This doesn't necessarily mean I'm going one by one. In fact, I'm not, I mean, in order. In fact, I'm not going in order. I'm writing scenes that I know I want to see. And once I have a number of cards, I'll put them up on the board and then I'll see where I have gaps. And then I'll start coming up with scenes to fill those gaps. And before you know it, I have a board. And from that board, I can either go to outline or depending on how fleshed out the board is, I can go to script.
Very cool. That's great. Really, really good to hear. We are getting very close to 3 o'clock. Do you need to leave right at 3, or if, do you have
No, I'm
a
good for a
couple
little
more
bit.
questions? Okay. Okay, good.
I had a question. Jose, going back to your introduction, I was mentioning Latinx representation. So, and I've heard a few different people discuss what is more helpful. So, what, in your opinion, is more helpful in getting more minority representation out there? Is it the producer, the writer, a celebrity, etc.? Like, how can that be better handled and increased?
Well, look, everything that you see on your screen starts with a writer. Um, an actor can't deliver a speech, a director can't direct a scene, a designer can't design a set without a writer being there first. So it has to start on the page. But a writer writing something without someone being willing to make it uh, is also not going to get very far, unless you're talking, a novelist or a playwright or something like that. In terms of screen work, somebody has to put up the money to make it. So that means we're at the whim of the studios. And the studios and the streamers ultimately have final say on what kind of representation you're going to see on screen. And there was a big push about 10 years ago, and you guys may or may not have felt this or seen it, but to bring better representation to the screen, to cast more actors of color, to buy more material from writers of color, to hire more diverse cast and crews. And then a study came out about a year or two ago saying that all those initiatives were performative and they changed nothing.
And they changed what?
Nothing.
Oh,
Hmm.
Uh, and the studios basically went, yeah, we tried, didn't work, sorry. So what can we do? We can support diverse programming and movies. We can go see movies like we can go see shows like Andor and post about shows like Andor, which are not, about Latino themes, but they are because they're about uh, oppression. But it's got a couple of Latino leads, and so you can support that and you can post about that and you can make some noise about how much you like that show. Or you can go see movies like it's the first one that's coming to my head.
Centers.
Sinners, exactly. And you go see it, pay your money, post online. And if the studios see that there is money to be made by backing these plays, money's the only thing that speaks to them. And I get it.
Yeah.
It's show business. It's not show friendship. And they more and more they have stockholders to report to and board members that are making decisions for them. Um, if you watch the Apple show, The Studio, it's kind of a hilarious and depressing look at
Yeah.
how movies get made. And one thing that I heard Seth Rogen talk about was the sad truth that a lot of the people that he's worked with over the last 25 years in features love movies, yet are stuck with these jobs where they kind of have to contribute to the destruction of art because the business is a bastard and the business doesn't care about art. The business cares about returns.
Yeah. And which
So
is a good case to make for creative people writing, continue writing, continue creating the best way you can. And like you say, supporting shows that you like that may not be in the mainstream or getting the sort of publicity that
right,
they should get or deserving of.
right.
Yeah.
And look, we haven't really talked a whole lot about writing, but the one thing that everybody should be doing as writers is writing.
Mhm.
It's the only thing that's going to solve whatever problem you're having. Whether it's getting your work seen or getting a job or paying your rent or even feeling sad.
Sure.
If, writing, whenever my therapist used to be very, very hard on me about not writing enough, and it wasn't because I wasn't producing material. It's because he recognized that I felt like I had a purpose when I was writing on something instead of feeling adrift and wallowing in everything sucks. My emotions are down. I'm depressed.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sitting in front of your computer for 6 to 8 hours a day, you're making progress. Good progress, bad progress, doesn't matter. You're working towards something. And as writers, we have it in our grasp. Directors can't direct without a set and a crew and a cast and a script.
Yeah.
Actors can't act without a script.
Mhm.
We have it. We create it. So um do it. It's
Write your
it's the
way out
best
of
thing.
depression or write your way out of a problem. The
Yeah.
old, that old cliche,
Yeah. And
right?
when people feel that they're finally getting to that point where they're getting really good, because obviously nobody's great on their first script. Are there any other programs or internships that you'd recommend besides the academy one you mentioned earlier?
It's been so long since I was in that position that I don't really have my finger on the pulse of where these programs exist. I think you can probably go to your nearby universities and colleges and look around, literally look around for flyers that are posted or look on their website and see what they offer. But like I said, I'm not the best guy to ask about that.
Yeah. Well, you've given us so much great information, and
Thank you.
it's been such an honor to have you here.
Yes.
It's such a
Thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Yeah, and we're counting on seeing you in Scotland in October.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Real quick, Jose, is there anything that we should be looking forward to any new projects that you're working on that you can talk about? Maybe you can't.
Yeah, except I don't have a date for a release date for it yet. I was working on a show called The Burrows, which is the Duffer Brothers' next show after Stranger Things.
Oh, wow. Okay, I
Um,
hadn't heard about that.
it hasn't been widely publicized. There's been a couple articles in the trades about when the show got greenlit, when we cast our cast. We have Alfred Molina, Alfred Woodard, Gina Davis, Bill Pullman. It's an amazing
Oh,
cast.
wow.
Um, and we
It's great.
finished shooting in February, but we're not premiering until after Stranger Things drops, and there's no date for that yet.
Mhm.
So I think they'll probably drop around October, and then maybe we'll drop early in 26. But we're hoping to get a season 2 room started for that before we premiere.
Oh, great. I can't wait to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you to everybody who took their time this afternoon to attend. Really great seeing you. Kind of
Thank you, everybody.
missing you, seeing your names anyway. And hope you enjoyed it as much as, speaking for John and I have.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I put the link in the chat if you want to learn more about our October retreat. We'd love to talk with you about that if you're interested. And Jose, thanks again. This has been so interesting and wonderful.
Thank you.
all right. Take care, everybody.
All right, everybody have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Signing off.
Bye-bye.
Okay. See you next time.